Cleveland, Ohio, 1863. A 23-year-old bookkeeper puts $4,000 he can barely spare into a half-finished oil refinery. He ignores the gusher everyone else is chasing and buys the boring stuff instead. The barrel factory, the tank cars, the warehouse. Within 2 decades, a legal trick his own lawyers are about to invent will still be quietly running in 2026, financing part of the $348 trillion global debt crisis that finance ministers keep insisting is under control. That bookkeeper is John D. Rockefeller. That legal trick is the Standard Oil Trust of 1882, mostly forgotten outside business history footnotes, and about to become the through line of everything that follows. Standard Oil got broken into 34 pieces in 1911. Most people think that's the end of the story. The trustbuster wins. The monopoly dies. Credits roll. It isn't the end. It's the moment the method escaped the company. Rockefeller's Five-Tool Blueprint. Rockefeller didn't stop at owning one oil company. He assembled 5 separate pieces of corporate architecture, control the whole supply chain, buy or bankrupt every rival, wrap the whole thing in a legal shell. State law can't quite reach. Get close enough to the regulators that they end up writing your rules for you, and then spend philanthropy to turn history's most hated man into history's most generous man in under a decade. That's not a story about oil. It's a 5-tool blueprint. And instead of just retelling it, we're going to hold 4 of the biggest companies alive today up against every one of those 5 tools and score, honestly, how hard each one is actually running Rockefeller's playbook. Because the real answer isn't all 5, all the time. It's more interesting than that. Before we go tool by tool, one honest caveat. Some of what follows is contested in real courtrooms right now, and will flag exactly where that line sits. So let's start where Rockefeller started, not with a monopoly, but with a decision to stop paying other people for things he could own himself. Tool number 1, vertical integration. Most Cleveland refiners in the 1860s did one job, turn crude into kerosene, and bought everything else, barrels included, from independent suppliers. Rockefeller looked at that arrangement and saw 30 separate businesses skimming a margin off him, so he built his own barrel-making operation. He acquired his own fleet of tank cars and worked out confidential rate deals with the railroads hauling his oil. Deals that, according to the muckraking that eventually broke the story wide open, also quietly skimmed a cut off his rivals' shipments. Every link in the chain that used to generate profit for somebody else, he pulled in-house until his production costs were structurally lower than anyone competing against him could ever match by working harder. Here's why that matters today. Ask yourself which company on earth looks the most like 1863 Rockefeller, and the answer isn't close. Amazon doesn't just sell you things. Its own trucks make the delivery, its own systems process the payment, and increasingly, its own servers run large chunks of the rest of the internet. In 2025, Amazon's cloud division alone pulled in roughly $128.7 billion in revenue, on a company that did about $717 billion in total sales that year, a business Amazon backed into almost by accident while building infrastructure for itself. The same way Rockefeller backed into owning barrel factories. Score Amazon on vertical integration, and you're maxing out the scale. But here's where the story gets more interesting than every giant does this equally, because it doesn't. Score Alphabet on the same axis, and it's moderate, not extreme. Search, ads, and Android are tightly integrated. But Google doesn't own the fiber in the ground or the chips in most phones the way Amazon owns its trucks. Score Berkshire Hathaway, and it barely registers at all. Warren Buffett's company owns railroads and insurers and candy makers, but it has never tried to weld them into one seamless supply chain the way Rockefeller did. And if you want to see vertical integration taken further than Rockefeller ever managed, you don't even need an American company. Saudi Aramco doesn't just extract crude. As of its own 2025 annual filing, it routes 53% of its own crude oil production straight into its own refineries and chemical plants. More than half its own barrels never touch an open market at all before Aramco has already captured the value twice. Rockefeller had to build vertical integration company by company, deal by deal, over a decade. The Saudi state simply decreed it into one company from the top down. Same tool, different amount of friction. So what does that actually cost you? The person watching this and not the CEO of anything. Let's not eyeball it. Let's build it from the one data set in America built specifically to answer that question. The Bureau of Labor Statistics' most recent consumer expenditure survey puts the average American household's annual spending on gasoline at $2,411 and total transportation spending, including vehicles and insurance, at $13,318, with healthcare running $6,197 a year on average. To be transparent about the limits of that data, the BLS doesn't publish a line item for money spent specifically on one retail platform, so any number claiming to isolate your personal Amazon bill down to the dollar is a guess dressed up as government statistics. What the government actually measures is that transportation and healthcare alone, two sectors where a small number of vertically integrated giants set the terms, already consume roughly a quarter of what the average household spends in a year. You don't get to negotiate those prices. You get to choose which vertically integrated giant collects them. Tool 2. Horizontal Consolidation. Which brings us to tool number 2. Horizontal consolidation. If vertical integration means owning every step of your own chain, horizontal consolidation means making sure nobody else's chain exists to compete with. In 1872, over about 3 months, Rockefeller's people went to every refinery owner left in Cleveland with one offer: sell now at a fair price, or watch us drop kerosene below cost until you go bankrupt and we buy the wreckage for nothing. Historians call it the Cleveland Massacre. By the end of that single winter, Rockefeller controlled 25 of Cleveland's 26 refineries. The logic underneath it was simple and it was brutal. Make the sale attractive, and make refusal ruinous, so that either way the refinery ends up in Rockefeller's hands. Modern horizontal consolidation rarely needs a price war anymore. It just needs a checkbook. Meta didn't out-innovate Instagram or WhatsApp. It bought them before they could grow into threats. Score Meta on this tool and it's near the top. 3 of the world's largest social platforms. One owner, functionally one choice disguised as 3 apps. Score Alphabet similarly high, YouTube, DoubleClick, and dozens of smaller acquisitions folded into a single search and advertising machine over 2 decades. It's worth pausing here, because the honest version of this story has to include the fact that regulators aren't sitting still for it. In the fall of 2025, a federal judge actually ruled against the Federal Trade Commission's attempt to unwind one of these consolidations, finding the agency hadn't proven Meta currently holds an illegal monopoly, whatever the historical acquisitions looked like. A ruling the FTC has said it plans to appeal, as of this recording. We'll come back to that fight in a minute, because it matters more than the competitor claim you've probably heard, which is that regulators simply never touch this stuff. Horizontal consolidation isn't a uniquely American habit, either, and this is where the story gets genuinely strange. In China, the same instinct runs through the government itself, rather than around it. Back in 1998, Beijing didn't wait for one company to swallow its rivals. It ordered an asset swap between the country's 2 state oil giants, specifically so that each one would come out the other side as a single, fully vertically and horizontally integrated company. And Beijing's asset regulator has kept engineering similar mergers among state oil companies ever since. Rockefeller needed 3 months of ruthless deal-making to consolidate one city's refineries. The Chinese state can do the equivalent with a single policy memo, because in a state-owned system, the government doesn't need to capture the regulator. It already is the regulator, the owner, and the buyer of last resort, all in the same building. If you're finding the pattern recognition part of this useful, this is exactly the kind of connective tissue between historical structure and current headlines we build every video around. So if that's your kind of thing, the subscribe button is right there, and it genuinely does help more people find these deep dives before the next one drops. Tool 3. The holding company. Tool number 3, and this is the one modern companies borrow most openly. The trust, or what we'd now call the holding company. Standard Oil of Ohio was legally barred from holding stock in businesses chartered anywhere else. So in 1882, Rockefeller's lawyers built a separate legal entity around that exact loophole, the trust, that held stock in every Standard Oil company at once, controlled by 41 shareholders who were mostly Rockefeller and his inner circle. The trust itself made nothing. It refined nothing. It just owned things. And that separation between the company that does the work and the entity that owns the company that does the work turned out to be the single most influential piece of paper in the history of American business law. Here's the part almost nobody says out loud. The closest modern analog didn't stumble into this structure by accident. It copied Rockefeller's playbook on purpose. When Google reorganized into Alphabet in 2015, splitting the profitable search and ads business off from moonshot projects like Waymo and Verily under one umbrella holding company. Former Google CEO Eric Schmidt later said the design was directly inspired by a trip he encouraged the founders to take to Omaha, to study how Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway operated as a collection of independently run subsidiaries under one parent, which means score Alphabet very high on the trust structure tool, and score Berkshire Hathaway even higher. Berkshire is, structurally, the purest living descendant of the 1882 trust operating today. Dozens of unrelated businesses, one holding company, one set of shareholders who never have to touch the operations. Amazon, by contrast, scores low here. It never bothered hiding behind a holding company shell, because as a single unified corporation, it didn't need one to do what it wanted to do. And this is where the story stops being about tech and oil, and starts being about your government's checkbook. Banks discovered the exact same trick, just 74 years later, and with an act of Congress instead of a law office. The Bank Holding Company Act of 1956 formally created the legal category, bank holding company, putting the Federal Reserve in charge of supervising these parent entities the same way state law once tried, and failed, to supervise Standard Oil. JPMorgan Chase is a bank holding company. So is Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. JPMorgan alone carried roughly $4 trillion in total assets as of the end of 2024, the largest bank in the country, and one of a small handful that sit inside a category Congress had to invent, specifically because bank holding companies, like Rockefeller's trust before them, were structured to slip past whatever rules existed to stop them. Global debt crisis explained. Now here's country debt explained in one sentence. And it's the part of this story that almost never gets told next to the Rockefeller history. When the U.S. government needs to borrow money, it doesn't sell bonds directly to the public in some open bazaar. It sells them first to a short list of roughly 24 banks that the New York Fed designates as primary dealers, obligated to bid at every single Treasury auction. That list is dominated by the exact same holding companies we just scored: JPMorgan Securities, Goldman Sachs, BofA Securities, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, and Wells Fargo among them. So when you hear that global debt hit a record $348.3 trillion in 2025, with public debt alone climbing to roughly $106.7 trillion worldwide, the honest picture of global debt isn't some abstract number floating over Washington and Beijing. It's placed, priced, and distributed through the exact holding company architecture Rockefeller's lawyers invented to dodge state law in 1882, just formalized, regulated, and made permanent by an act of Congress in 1956. The trick didn't just survive, it got deputized. Tool 4. Regulatory capture. Tool number 4. Regulatory capture. And this is the tool where the honest version of the story actually cuts against the easy narrative. Rockefeller didn't just lobby politicians. He helped set the purity standards kerosene had to clear, standards drawn tightly enough that his own plants sailed through them while smaller rivals struggled. And he negotiated freight rates with railroads that effectively taxed his competitors to subsidize his own shipping. The regulators of his era weren't independent referees. For years, they were closer to House officials. Does that pattern repeat today? Sometimes, yes, but not as cleanly as the nothing has changed since 1882 version of this story wants you to believe, and treating every modern giant as equally regulator-proof gets the current moment backwards. In August 2024, a U.S. district judge ruled that Google held illegal monopoly power in general internet search and search advertising, finding the company had held roughly 90% of desktop search and nearly 95% of mobile search, a case that went on to remedies limiting Google's exclusive default search deals. That's not regulatory capture working as designed, that's the opposite. A regulator that eventually bit. Amazon is currently fighting a similar fight. The FTC and 17 state attorneys general sued in 2023, alleging Amazon uses an algorithm, reportedly nicknamed Project Nessie internally, to punish sellers who price products lower on competing sites. Among other allegations, Amazon disputes the characterization, and the case is now scheduled for a bench trial starting in February 2027, after Amazon successfully pushed the original October 2026 date back. Meanwhile, Meta actually won its case. In November 2025, a federal judge ruled the FTC hadn't proven Meta currently holds an illegal monopoly, regardless of what its acquisition history looked like on paper, and as of this recording, the agency has signaled it plans to challenge that ruling. So which is it? Captured regulators or a functioning system? Honestly, both, depending which company and which year you're looking at. Rockefeller operated in an era before the Sherman Act had any real teeth, when regulatory capture was close to total. What we have now looks more like Rockefeller's playbook running headlong into a legal system that occasionally, unevenly, fights back, sometimes losing outright, the way the FTC just did against Meta. Tool 5. Philanthropy as Legitimacy. Which brings us to tool number 5, the one Rockefeller himself considered his masterstroke: philanthropy as legitimacy. In 1913, he created the Rockefeller Foundation, and through an earlier vehicle called the General Education Board, his money became the financial engine behind the modern shape of American medicine. But the popular version of this story, the one that credits the Rockefeller Foundation with authoring the reforms outright, gets the sequencing wrong, and it's worth being precise about who actually did what. One honest caveat before we get into it: what follows is a documented grant-making record, not evidence of some coordinated campaign for control. We'll sit with that distinction more fully later. The famous 1910 Flexner Report, which evaluated 155 medical schools across the U.S. and Canada, was commissioned and published by the Carnegie Foundation, not Rockefeller's. Andrew Carnegie's money wrote the diagnosis. Rockefeller's money paid for the surgery. The following year, Rockefeller and his General Education Board began funding the implementation of Flexner's recommendations directly, and the numbers are worth sitting with. The Osler papers held in the Chesney Medical Archives show a roughly $1.5 million grant to Johns Hopkins Medical School, conditioned on Hopkins requiring its clinical professors to abandon private practice entirely and work full-time for the university, a condition that prominent physicians of the era, including William Osler, publicly warned would damage clinical training rather than improve it. The money didn't just fund medicine. It came with strings attached to how medicine would be taught, and those strings got pulled. Abraham Flexner, the same man who wrote the original diagnostic report, was made Secretary of Rockefeller's General Education Board in 1913, and personally directed where roughly $180 million in Rockefeller money flowed into American medical schools between 1910 and 1930. The same man who decided which schools deserved to survive, now controlling the checkbook that decided which schools actually would. Within 2 decades, the wave of accreditation reform that Grant helped fund had helped shrink the country's medical schools from roughly 150 to 66, and closed 5 of the 7 medical schools then training black physicians in America, along with most of the era's separate women's medical colleges. This wasn't the Rockefeller Foundation quietly shaping medicine from the shadows the way some retellings suggest. The documented record shows the report itself came from Carnegie, and Rockefeller's contribution was funding the specific, conditional implementation of it, which is arguably more consequential, not less. Money with strings is a form of control money without them never gets. Score today's billionaires on the same tool. And the picture actually splits in an interesting way. Bill Gates built his own foundation, funding it the way Rockefeller did, with large-scale, single-donor grant-making in health and education, the same funding architecture as the General Education Board, though run today under modern disclosure rules the 1913 board never had to answer to. Warren Buffett took the opposite path. Rather than build a rival institution to his own name, he pledged the overwhelming majority of his fortune to Gates's foundation instead of creating his own, a genuinely different move from the Rockefeller model, where legitimacy required your name on the building. Jeff Bezos's philanthropic vehicle, the Bezos Earth Fund, is younger and smaller than either, more a late entrant catching up to a 100-year-old game than a rival architecture. Philanthropy still buys legitimacy in 2026. It just doesn't buy it identically for everyone who tries. The Five-Tool Scorecard. Add it up across all 5 tools, and here's what the honest scorecard looks like. Company by company, instead of the flattening, they all do everything version. Amazon, maxed out on vertical integration, high on horizontal consolidation, low on the trust structure, contested and ongoing on regulatory capture, and thin on philanthropy relative to its size. Alphabet, moderate to high on vertical integration, high on horizontal consolidation, very high on the trust structure, the one company that borrowed it on the record, and as of the past 2 years, the company regulators have actually beaten in open court. Berkshire Hathaway, low on vertical integration and regulatory entanglement, but the single purest trust structure alive today, with philanthropy running through someone else's foundation rather than its own. And the bank holding companies, moderate on vertical integration, high on horizontal consolidation after decades of community bank mergers, very high on the trust structure because Congress wrote it into federal law, and structurally embedded in the exact machinery that finances government debt itself. Now the fair pushback, and it's worth engaging honestly instead of dismissing it. Rockefeller would have told you none of this is a scandal. It's just efficiency. He believed, with what reads today as genuine conviction and not just PR, that competition wasted capital and consolidation served consumers. And on narrow terms, some of that argument holds up better than it's comfortable to admit. Amazon really does deliver in 2 days. AWS really does keep half the internet running without most of it going down. A search engine you don't pay for in cash is still undeniably useful. Efficiency and extraction aren't opposites. They can be, and often are, the exact same mechanism viewed from 2 different bank accounts. That tension doesn't resolve cleanly, and anyone telling you it does is selling you something. Was any of this coordinated? 150 years of executives quietly reading the same secret playbook? Almost certainly not, and it's worth being precise about that, because the more interesting and better documented explanation is structural, not conspiratorial. The legal and economic incentives that rewarded Rockefeller's 5 moves in 1882 mostly still reward the same 5 moves today. So companies that never read a page of Standard Oil history keep independently reaching for the same tools. The way water finds the same low ground on a hillside regardless of who's watching. Alphabet is the one clear exception, the one company on record saying it copied the structure on purpose. Everyone else just kept discovering that the same incentives produce the same architecture, generation after generation, whether or not anyone in the room has ever heard Rockefeller's name. One quote gets attached to Rockefeller in almost every retelling of this story, including probably every other version of this video you've seen. Competition is a sin. It's worth knowing that, quote, researchers who've traced it back have found no verified primary source record of Rockefeller ever actually saying it. It first shows up in print attributed to him decades after his death. Whether or not he ever said those exact words, it's hard to argue with the sentence as a description of what he built. 5 tools, tested against the 4 biggest corporate structures alive today, and against a Chinese state oil sector and a Saudi state oil company that never needed the American legal workarounds at all, because the state simply was the regulator from day one. The verdict: same playbook. So here's the verdict, and it isn't a stock tip, because pattern recognition and portfolio advice are 2 different things, and this video is only qualified to give you one of them. The tools Rockefeller assembled between 1863 and 1913 didn't disappear when Standard Oil got broken into 34 pieces. They dispersed, and 40 years, then 80, then 150 years later, they show up independently in a search company that copied the structure on purpose, a retailer that backed into it by accident, an insurance conglomerate that never needed a name for what it was already doing, and a banking sector that got the whole architecture written directly into federal law. The honest addition to that story isn't that nothing has changed since 1911. It's that some of it has. Google lost in federal court in a way Standard Oil's competitors in 1900 never got close to, and Meta beat back the government entirely, in a way Rockefeller never had to. The pattern is real. So is the pushback against it. Next time we go deeper into just one thread from tonight, the primary dealer network, and exactly how a handful of these same holding companies end up pricing sovereign debt for governments that can't say no. Because once you've seen where the 1882 trick actually ends up, you start noticing it everywhere else too.